How should we understand what the law is? Is it simply commands backed by force? Or is it rational standards for conduct that compel rational agents to comply? In this video, we'll look at legal positivism along with natural law theory and see which legal framework best accounts for what is beneficial in society. To start, let's get into some definitions. Legal positivism states that what makes something legal is that it is permitted by certain rules established inside of a society. Said in another way, legal positivism means that normative judgments have no influence on what is legal and what is illegal inside of a society. This means that there are no judgments about what the law ought say. It's just what the law does say. When it comes to natural law theory, Thomas Aquinas would state that it is an ordinance of reason for the common good issued by one who has care of the community and has promulgated. This means that natural law theory is an attempt to work out the best way of living together. This would mean that normative judgments necessarily play some role in determining what the law says. All right, now let's break down the problems and the pros from both theories. So a positive of legal positivism is that it avoids confusing categories by separating the question of what is legal from what ought be legal. To give a quick example, take the fugitive slave law back in the day. So the fugitive slave law stated that if there was a runaway slave and a sheriff found them, they were to bring them back and put them back as a slave. However, under legal positivism, there would be no moral implication about that law. People would see that it is just simply a law and it has no normative connotations to it. It would just be something that is law, but it's not necessarily good. However, even though we're able to separate what is moral from what is legal, there still becomes a glaring problem. Because it's still law, legal positivism states that we have some sort of legal obligation to perform sometimes horrible things. Take the fugitive slave law again. Even though we'd say, okay, just because it's legal doesn't necessarily mean that it's moral or good, there would still be some sort of legal obligation for a sheriff to bring back a runaway slave. So it's like, what is compelling them to perform that legal action? Right? That's when it would simply be the force, but there would be no practical reason towards it. So the problem would be that there's no compelling reason. It's just force. And we are rational creatures and we need some sort of rational conduct or rational standard to inform our conduct. Now, another problem with legal positivism is that it may just be impossible in practice. Let's take a law like due diligence, which states like, okay, what you ought do or the duty of care that you have for something. To establish what you ought do, it presupposes or it invokes that you have to make some sort of normative judgment. Like, let's say when it comes to returning something to a store. Let's say you found a diamond on the store worth like $1 million or something like that, right? They presuppose that you have a duty to return that to that store, right? Or else it could potentially be theft or something like that. So the question would be, can you do that without invoking some sort of normative judgment? And this would kind of get into exclusive legal positivism versus inclusive legal positivism. Exclusive legal positivism would state that there is actually no room for normative judgments. Inclusive legal positivism would say there is some room, but they're kind of agnostic on exactly how this would hash out. So I won't get too much into that right now. Now, a positive for the natural law theory is that it distinguishes between what is law and commands backed by force. The governing force for this is practical reason, meaning that, if something is unreasonable or it's unjust, that is simply commands backed by force. Like, let's say there was a law that said, oh, you have to steal from people and take cookies from grandmas. They'd either hold to the strong reading, which would say an unjust law is simply not a law. The analogy for this is cubic zirconium is not diamonds, or they'd hold to the weak reading, which would state that a unjust law is a defective law. This would be an analogy for this would be like, let's say you had a tiger or a cheetah that's supposed to be super fast. Let's say the cheetah broke its leg and now it's not going super fast as it should, as what is commonly associated with cheetah. So it's still a cheetah, but just a defective cheetah in that sense. Now, some of the problems associated with the natural law theory is that it may allow judges leeway to make calls on morality. They can say that, we had to make this decision because the law calls for it, because morality calls for it. Another problem associated with the natural law theory is that it implies that those who disagree on what the law should say also disagree on what the law is. This is because since morals or normative judgments would necessarily play some role in the law, then if you disagree on what the law says, then you would necessarily agree on what the law is. One final problem would just be, okay, so natural law theory, if you have the practical reason, well, what's the force? What is going to actually make people do it? Because with legal positivism, we could say, we have force, we have things like the government, regulatory bodies, and things like that, where they can put law into place. But under natural law theory, people are expected to just follow it. And it might be reasonable, but why should they follow it? What's the command for them to do what the law states? All right, now I'll kind of offer some arguments in defense of natural law theory and how you could respond to these. So when it comes to people disagreeing with, what the law should say, and therefore disagreeing on what the law is, to that I'd say disagreement doesn't prove that something doesn't work. I mean, in the past, people used to disagree on whether the earth was round or whether it was flat, but yet the earth was still round nonetheless. So when it comes to things like law, even though there may be some disagreements, there's still that right answer, and we can find that through reason and logic, which I believe is accessible to everyone. Then when it comes to things like judges and things like that, where they have room to include morality inside of their decisions, well, ultimately, I believe that in a lot of these decisions, this happens either way. Like when we looked at things like Brown versus Board of Education, which I'm referring to, they looked at the Constitution a little bit, but they also appealed to, what is right and, what we should be doing and things like that. And then if we ran into a situation where the law was unjust or caused undue harm, then, there's room for the strong reading or the weak reading, which would say either it's not a law or that it's a unjust law. And we could prove that by saying that it causes harm or it's defective and things like that. Finally, when answering the question about commanding force, saying like, there's no commanding force, so why should we follow the law? Man, I'd say that that's just a completely wrong way to understand what the law is. I'd say that you have an obligation, or the commanding force to follow that law comes from the fact that it's reasonable and it's rational, right? As I said, once again, I believe that us as humans, we're rational creatures, and what should bind us is rational standards. That should inform our conduct. So I feel like the commanding force just comes from a human being acting in accordance with reason. All right, guys, thanks for staying here to the end. For my final takeaway, I'll end by saying I do uphold the natural law theory. And the reason why I feel this way is because I think that the way we should think about the law is in terms of what is right and what is good. That way, we end up doing things or not doing things, not because we'll get some negative or positive reinforcement, like, negative reinforcement, going to jail, positive reinforcement, having people cheer for us and things like that. But instead, we do things because they align with reason and because they're right. I believe that when we start doing things and just because there's some force behind it, we end up doing it for the wrong reasons. We do it not because it's right, but just because we're kind of forced to. However, with that being said, I'd really love to hear your guys' comments down below. So let me know what you guys think, and I'll be dropping new videos on philosophy, theology, law, and things like that in the future. You guys have a good one. Thanks for watching.